Hello everyone, this is Dr. Geri Puleo, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on burnout during organizational change, an introduction to the BDOC model. Now, what exactly is the BDOC model? Well, BDOC stands for burnout during organizational change. And I developed this model after conducting extensive research of people whose companies were undergoing major transformational organizational change. And what I discovered was how these individuals felt about the change and how these feelings, as well as the organizational practices, caused them to burn out. In addition, I also looked into what they did in order to remove themselves from burnout. So let's take a look at this model in a little bit more detail. Now, the descent into burnout is rather quick, particularly in comparison to the recovery from burnout. During organizational change, but I've also discovered this in people whose companies were not actually undergoing a change initiative. Initially, people start out with hope. They're excited about their job, they're excited about their organization, they're excited about the challenges, and they're very optimistic in terms of what the future will hold. But unfortunately, due to some of their assumptions, their expectations, as well as ways in which the organization is treating them, they started going down the slippery slope into a full-blown burnout. So initially, when their expectations were not being met, they became, not surprisingly, frustrated. The frustration, after a while, began to really build until they became angry. But then after they became angry, they became apathetic. They no longer cared. And this lack of caring about what you're doing at work is very indicative of workplace-related burnout. It's only after they became apathetic, where they didn't care and their work life had little to no meaning, that they entered into a full-blown burnout. Now, what is a full-blown burnout? A full-blown burnout occurs when you feel like an empty shell of a building that are the only remaining timbers after the building has been firebombed. In other words, you're there on the outside, but inside there's this uncomfortable feeling of being, well, emotionally dead. A lot of people don't understand, though, is that companies contribute a great deal into creating feelings of burnout in their employees. Now, I personally discovered 10 different ways that companies took their employees from feeling hopeful and optimistic and ready to go and give 110% to move down into frustration and then eventually anger and apathy. It can be the role of other employees. It can be the lack of a vision or direction. There can be politics, too much emphasis on the financial bottom line, even unethical or illegal requests. All of these, plus a few others, are ways in which the company contributes to burnout. Now, the good thing is to realize that it's not just in your head, and it's not just that you cannot cope with stress. During burnout, you always have to look at the environment that is also creating stressors that are contributing to your feelings of being burned out. Now, that said, I mentioned that the descent into burnout is relatively quick. However, your recovery from burnout is agonizingly slow. And what does that mean? You start from being burned out, where you feel apathetic and have no feelings and you're just miserable. And the way that my participants had to try to recover from the burnout was only by psychologically or physiologically removing themselves. Before they could gain the necessary self-knowledge and acceptance, as well as revised expectations of their work environment, which is the revised psychological contract, all of them had to make a conscientious decision to physically or psychologically remove themselves from their work environment. So how did they do this? Well, there were several ways. Many of them engaged in escapist activities. It may have been gambling. It may have been drug use, drinking, anything that made them feel that they had gone away from that situation. Now, some of the participants were a little bit more proactive and a little bit more positive. They instead requested and were granted internal transfers within the company. In other words, they knew that the company in itself was good, but the situation that they were undergoing was just untenable, and they didn't want to leave the company, they just wanted to leave their immediate situation. The vast majority, however, physically left. They either left the organization by, most of them did it voluntarily by resigning, and some of them didn't even have other jobs to go to. Some of them, due to a downsizing, left the company involuntarily through a downsizing or a layoff. What's most disturbing and what is indicative of just how pervasive and unsettling the feelings of burnout are is that a large percentage actually left the industry. It wasn't just the company, they became totally disenchanted with the industry. And they felt that the only way that they could recover their psychological and emotional sanity was to totally change careers. Now, that said, if you look at this diagram, the descent is rather quick from hope down to burnout, whereas the recovery is dragged out and is slower. But you also notice that there's something called residual burnout. If any of those organizational factors or the unmet expectations occur in a totally different situation within about 2 years from when you've burned out, you can go right back into any of the stages of burnout, from a full-blown burnout to feelings of increased frustration, anger, or apathy. To overcome this, I encourage you to watch one of my other webinars here on anewwaytowork.com that talks about different ways that you can actually recover from burnout.